The US Navy just spent $13 billion on an aircraft carrier, and the deadliest weapon on board isn't what you think. It doesn't fire missiles or launch jets. You could watch it all day and miss it completely, but it's already changing how the next war gets fought. Hit subscribe because what I'm about to show you will make you see naval warfare completely differently. The $13 billion question. The Ford-class carrier program became one of the most expensive military projects in American history, and critics had a field day with it. $13 billion for a single ship sounds obscene, music, until you realize what the Navy was actually purchasing. They weren't buying a bigger boat. They were buying time itself, weaponized. Music. Previous carriers could cycle aircraft, sure, but they did it at a pace that hadn't fundamentally changed since the 1960s. The Ford changed the equation entirely. Music. It generates 3 times the electrical power of a Nimitz-class carrier. Enough to run a small city. That power doesn't just turn lights on. It feeds systems that compress what used to take hours into minutes. But here's what nobody tells you about that price tag. The Navy wasn't comparing it to building one old carrier. Music. They were comparing it to the operational cost of running multiple carriers to achieve the same effect over 30 years. When you do that math, suddenly, music $13 billion starts looking like a bargain. But the real cost wasn't measured in dollars. Music. It was measured in something far more uncomfortable that the Navy had ignored for decades, the invisible enemy. And every military planner knows that missiles sink ships and jets win battles. But there's a third enemy that's destroyed more operational plans than any weapon system. Time friction. It's the accumulated minutes lost between every action on a carrier deck, the 30 seconds it takes to reposition an aircraft. Music. The 2 minutes waiting. For an elevator, the 5-minute safety check that can't be rushed. Individually, these delays seem trivial. Across hundreds of sorties over days of operations, they compound into something lethal. The Nimitz-class carriers, for all their power, were designed when the Navy assumed they'd fight short. Music. But modern conflicts don't work that way anymore. They stretch across weeks, testing endurance over explosiveness. During Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS, and carriers found themselves grinding through sustained operations that exposed every bottleneck in their design, aircraft waited in queues. Crews worked past exhaustion, managing workflows that hadn't been optimized in decades. What the Navy discovered wasn't just inconvenient, it was strategic poison that threatened the entire concept of carrier dominance. The speed nobody talks about. Music, forget top speed. Forget how many knots a carrier can push through the water. There's a different speed that decides wars and music. It's called sort generation rate. This measures how many times a carrier can launch, recover, music, refuel, rearm, and relaunch its aircraft in a 24-hour period. For decades, American carriers averaged around 120 sorties per day during normal operations. You know, that sounds impressive until you realize it's barely changed since the 1980s. Despite massive advances in every other military technology, the Ford class was engineered from the keel up to hit 160 sorties per day, with surge capacity reaching 270 sorties when needed. That 40 sortie difference doesn't sound dramatic until you multiply it across a week of operations. Music. That's 280 additional strikes, reconnaissance missions, or air superiority patrols that an adversary has to defend against. But here's the part that should terrify any opponent. The Ford doesn't just hit those numbers in perfect conditions during peacetime. Demonstrations. Music. So here's my question. If you are planning to fight the US Navy, would you rather face a carrier that exhausts itself in 3 days or one that's still launching strikes in week 2? Music. Why old carriers can't compete. The Nimitz class wasn't a failure. For Chaka Music. It was a masterpiece of 1970s engineering that served brilliantly for 40 years, but it was built around assumptions that no longer hold. Steam catapults require a small army of technicians and regular maintenance cycles. They launch aircraft at fixed power settings, which means heavier planes need multiple attempts or reduced fuel loads. The weapons elevators move ordnance at speeds barely faster than a commercial building elevator. Crew size on a Nimitz runs around 3,200 sailors just for ship operations, not counting the 2,500-person air wing. That's 5,700 people who need to eat, sleep, and stay combat effective for months at sea. The Ford dropped ship crew to 2,600 through automation. Those missing 600 sailors represent bottlenecks that no longer exist, systems that now run themselves, processes that no longer require human intervention at every step. But cutting crew size revealed something unexpected about how carriers actually fail in combat. The China calculation. Chinese military planners don't lose sleep over American carriers because they're big or music powerful. They lose sleep because of where they can go and how long they can stay there. The first island chain, the string of territories from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines, represents China's defensive perimeter. Any carrier operating inside that chain sits within range of hundreds of land-based missiles, submarines, and aircraft. But here's the problem China faces. Their defensive strategy assumes American carriers will behave like they always have. Launch a major strike package, withdraw to regroup, return for another wave. The Ford class breaks that assumption by refusing to pause. Instead of massive strikes followed by lulls, it applies continuous pressure that forces Chinese defenses to remain active around the clock. Air defense radars that stay on constantly burn through components faster. Missile crews that can't rest make mistakes. Command centers processing constant threat data get overwhelmed. The real nightmare for China isn't that the Ford is harder to kill. It's that Chinese defenses might bleed themselves dry trying to survive its operational tempo without the carrier firing a single shot. The elevator that changes everything, the advanced weapons. Elevators on the Ford became a national joke. They were years late, billions over budget, and broke down constantly during testing. Critics called them the perfect symbol of Pentagon incompetence. What those critics missed was why the Navy refused to abandon them, despite the problems. On a Nimitz-class carrier, moving a bomb from the weapons magazine to the flight deck takes 13 minutes on average. Music. The new elevators were designed to do it in 60 seconds. That 12-minute difference per weapon load translates into hours saved across a day of operations. But speed was only part of the equation. The old elevators could only operate in specific conditions. The new system uses electromagnetic linear motors that work in conditions that would ground old elevators entirely. They require 70% fewer sailors to operate because the process is almost entirely automated. The Navy eventually got them working, and when they did, sorting rates jumped exactly as the music models predicted. The elevator controversy was never about whether the technology worked. It was about whether the Navy was willing to bet the future of carrier aviation on systems that had never been tested in combat. That bet is about to be tested in ways nobody wants, and the answer will reshape naval warfare for the next 50 years. What do you think happens when this system faces real combat stress? Tell me in the comments if you think it holds up or falls apart. The weapon that doesn't fire. The secret weapon isn't a missile system. It isn't a radar array. It isn't even the electromagnetic catapults that got all the press attention. The weapon is operational tempo, and it's deadly precisely because it doesn't feel like a weapon at all. Traditional military power announces itself. Explosions, launches, visible destruction. Tempo kills quietly by denying adversaries the one thing every military force needs to function. Music, time to think, time to repair, time to adapt. When a carrier maintains 160 sorties per day for weeks, enemy forces face a math problem with no good answer. Do they keep air defenses active constantly, burning through components and exhausting crews? Do they stand down periodically and accept that aircraft will strike during those windows? Do they spread defenses thin to cover more area, or concentrate them and leave gaps? Every choice leads to failure because the carrier isn't giving them time to optimize. The Ford class turns aircraft carriers from siege weapons into grinding machines that win through exhaustion rather than decisive battle. This is why the $13 billion makes sense. The Navy didn't buy a ship. They bought the ability to operate inside an enemy's decision cycle continuously, forcing them to react music rather than act until mistakes compound into collapse. That's the secret weapon. The most dangerous weapon on a modern aircraft carrier isn't what it fires. It's how relentlessly it can keep firing when everyone expects it to stop. That's the secret changing naval warfare right now. Music. If this made you see carriers differently, hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis that goes beyond the headlines.